Now, the government has held firm in its standoff with the House of Lords as MPs last night rejected 10 amendments made to the Rwanda deportation bill. The bill will return to the Lords tomorrow, where it's expected to face further changes, turning into a game of political ping-pong. Speaking on Times Radio this morning, Labour peer Lord Falconer said this will be dragged out for as long as possible.
I think we've got to rally all our troops tomorrow to try to defeat it. I suspect we may well defeat many of these ponged back amendments from the Commons tomorrow. I think a win for us is holding out for as long as possible. Holding out to the next election may not be achievable, but what may be achievable is that it takes so long that the government can't get any of its flights to Rwanda.
Well, Richard Power-Sayeed is still here to discuss this as well. I don't think it matters now, Richard, whether you're left-wing, right-wing. I mean, even if you notionally agree with the principle of sending people who shouldn't be in this country to a third country, regardless of all of that, I think most people agree that this Rwanda thing ain't ever going to work.
I mean, I think that there might be flights before the next election. I don't think that's impossible. The point is that that is not the big election-shifting change that Rishi Sunak is betting on it being.
Why is he doing that, by the way? Because every time he says it, he sounds more ridiculous. Because we all know, and I made this point yesterday, and sorry to interject, by the way. I made this point yesterday, that the worst thing for Rishi Sunak would be for some flights to take off, but with about 35 people on them, because that would be worse than none taking off at all. Because at least if they didn't take off, he could say, look, I tried, I was stopped by the House of Lords, I was stopped by Labour, I was stopped by the courts. But if they do take off, and there's like, a couple of dozen people on them, at best, over the course of 6 months, a couple of hundred. That's not going to look like success.
Well, I mean, I think the government has already said that the first flights probably will have very few people on them, which, as you say, is not going to be a good look. There was probably a time when the Conservatives could imagine trying to run an election on a how are you going to, do you support the Rwanda policy or not? But Yvette Cooper hasn't allowed them to do that. She spiked their guns by basically saying, I broadly agree, but you're getting all of the details wrong. Whether she is right to do that or not, it's definitely been an electorally savvy thing to do. I think the problem is that for several decades now, as in, let's say 3 decades, the whole political class has been saying to itself, we don't have the political space to be really frank with the people of this country about what's going on with asylum seekers. We've got to do what David Blunkett, Home Secretary to Tony Blair, described as, am I going to get this right? It was something like act mean and act tough and be seen to do it so that you can then do some sensible policies afterwards that will actually make a difference to people's lives. Kind of sounds like a sensible strategy. He's basically admitting that lots of asylum and immigration policy is performatively mean in order to get the public to trust you so that you can then do things that will be effective in controlling migration.
Rather than reactionary.
Right, but ultimately that hasn't been very effective because what's it done? It's created enormous animosity against asylum seekers, most of whom are extremely vulnerable people one way or another. And at the same time, it's not created safe routes into this country for people. So that's why we've got far more people coming in boats, right? People are coming in boats were people who used to come here safely, and we could triage them and decide if they were allowed to stay.
Is that a bit generous? Because there is I know this is largely a different discussion now, who are the people coming in boats, but there is a sense now. And I don't blame an individual for jumping in a boat if they can afford it and try and carve out a new life elsewhere. But it has become, as the world has got smaller, as we have the internet, people communicate. Years ago, if you lived in Eritrea, you'd have no idea what the asylum policy was or the English Channel boat crossing scenario. Now, all of that is at the click of people are aware. You can move around, and if you can get a few quid together, you can make it happen. So there's a very persuasive argument that actually most of the people taking the channel routes are not the vulnerable people escaping a tyrannical regime or the Syrian war or areas such as that, but actually young men who are deciding, I want a better life. And who blames them if you're escaping some of those places?
OK, the young men thing is a little bit invidious. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. A young man that I met recently, I talked to him about this. He's currently going through the asylum system. And he said, think about me back home at my dinner table with my family. There's my grandparents, there's my parents, there's my sisters. Who is going to go first? Who is going to try to escape our country where the government is authoritarian, where there's been 3 years of failed harvests, where people from my ethnicity can't get a job because we've always been discriminated against because the government's organised by the other ethnic group of our community? Who's going to go first? Is it going to be my grandparents? Of course not. Is it going to be my sister? She'll be raped.
I
Is
hear
it
what
going to
you're
be my dad? No, it's going to be me, a young man. That's why it's young men.
And then you bring your whole family over after, which makes the whole story a whole lot worse for a lot of electorate.
I think most people will hear the story of that young man and will think that is an honourable and an impressive individual who is risking their life for their family, and they are doing exactly what asylum seekers we should be saying should do, which is coming to the country, talking through their very difficult situation, and then the country gets to decide if they're allowed to stay or not.
A lot of people there will be people who will agree with that. Others might say that's a very generous assessment and a very specific anecdote that doesn't really reflect the general story of what is happening. But I mean, we can argue that forever. Rwanda will not be the answer. I think we all kind of agree on that. Let's bring in the Times chief political correspondent on this, Aubrey Allegretti. Aubrey, always good to get your view. Rwanda, the gift that keeps on giving from a political hack perspective, I suppose. It's never going to really be right, and we haven't got the time frame to ever see it fully up and running, I guess, even if Sunak does get some flights off the ground. But there are battles to happen before anybody jumps on an aeroplane, and they're happening right now.
That's right. So the Rwanda legislation, if you like, the sort of thing that's going to give effect to what ministers claim is proof that it is a safe third country in order to send migrants, is still stuck in the Houses of Parliament. It's been sort of buffeted between the House of Lords and the House of Commons in a process that's known as ping pong. And as this wasn't something that the Conservatives pledged to do in their 2019 manifesto, that means that the Commons can't say to the Lords, well, we promised to do this, and so you'd be standing in the way of a big manifesto commitment by blocking it. So the process now is that after the Commons voted against all of the House of Lords amendments, which were 10 in total, it's going to go back to the House of Lords on Wednesday. But one thing is certain, Rishi Sunak's plan to get flights in the air to Rwanda is still uncertain as well.
Yeah. So when it goes back, just explain what then happens, or it goes back to the House of Lords. They have a bit of a chinwag over these amendments that have been voted down. I mean, what are they supposed to do? Take those amendments and water them down themselves, or agree that they'll come up with new amendments? What's the process here?
So the House of Lords has effectively been adding amendments to this piece of legislation, which effectively puts sort of specific requirements or conditionalities on Rwanda to ensure that migrants being removed there will be treated fairly and safely. There were 10 amendments that the House of Lords originally put into this bill that the Commons took out. In the Commons, the government has a majority, whereas in the House of Lords, the Conservatives are not in the majority, and therefore they have to work to convince parties from across the political spectrum and, of course, crossbenchers as well, people who don't affiliate with a political party. Now, last time there was significant numbers that meant that the House of Lords could effectively add in these amendments. This time, MPs have sent the bill back and said, we don't want anything that you suggested. But there will be a much tighter fight because Labour is probably going to insist on sticking by about 5, 6, maybe 7 of the original 10 amendments, which means that this process of it being sort of buffeted between the Commons and the Lords could go on for some time.